right, thank you all for coming out. It's great to see you all here. This event is sponsored by the program in Environmental Studies at Tulane, and we have a lot of representatives of the program in the audience. It's an interdisciplinary major and minor that is a humanities and social science discipline that allows students to ask questions not only about what's happening to our planet, to our world, to our politics, but also to ask what is it doing to us? What is the knowledge of this great transition would be a very neutral way, I suppose, of putting it. What is it doing to the way we live our lives? And so students take English classes, literature classes, sociology classes, political science, economics, history, you name it. And I'm really excited to present these three excellent authors who are all approaching these questions in unique and I think innovative ways. Also, I want to say there's a few chairs up here if people in the back want to sit, but you know, or there are a few in the front. And so I stole the title of this talk, Writing the Apocalypse and After, shamelessly, from Martha Park's new book that's not yet out. But maybe I think we should probably begin there by all rights. And we're excited that you're here even before publication, but it's a collection of essays, and maybe you could begin by just explaining the general premise of the collection and the subtitle, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. My book is called World Without End, Essays on Apocalypse and After, and it's coming out in May, so y'all are going to be my guinea pigs for like an elevator pitch, and you can give me feedback afterward. But it's a collection of essays. There's kind of two tracks of like personal essays about growing up with in the church. My dad was a United Methodist pastor, and about my experience when he retired after 42 years. And then the other narratives are about people around the South, different locations around the South that are involved in conservation and environmental action, and kind of how faith or religious interpretations have kind of impacted the way that they live in the world, or their activism, or lack thereof, basically.
And the apocalypse aspect in particular, okay. I mean, can you introduce that idea? Because I think it's, I mean, on the one hand, you're in this great tradition of writers from the South writing about the South and religion and Southern culture, and yet you're also doing something I think completely new, which is involving these questions of environmental damage and devastation, and can you explain sort of why apocalypse in the subtitle?
Yes, so I had the title World Without End. Kind of, I always knew that I wanted that to be my title, and then my publishers came to me and said, "You have to change the title because there's too many things with that name." And so I said no, and we added this subtitle, Essays on Apocalypse and After, because it was a lot of the essays kind of deal obliquely with ideas of apocalypse and different ways you can interpret apocalypticism or the book of Revelation and climate change through that lens. But also I liked having World Without End, which is a line from the Gloria Patri, and apocalypse right next to each other, because I felt like it was within different Christian traditions kind of refuting each other, and I liked that tension in the title, that you can read in the idea of apocalypse into these traditions, but you can also take away this idea that there's not a world end coming in that same way. And so I just liked having them kind of right up next to each other like that.
Thank you. And we'll get into more detail into some of those essays in a minute, but I want to introduce the other members of our panel. Joselyn Takacs is a novelist with some New Orleans roots, and she's written a beautiful novel about a kind of apocalypse, I would say, the BP oil spill and the oyster trade. And that really resonated with me because I moved to New Orleans in the middle of that. I mean, I remember walking through the airport and seeing just those images of the oil spilling into the ocean. But you've done a really immersive, deep examination of it through the story of families and multi-generational relationships. And so I wondered if you could explain sort of the genesis of your novel and the basic idea behind it.
Sure. It's really great to be here. My novel, as Nathaniel mentioned, is Pierce Oysters, and it's called that because it's based on the Pierce oyster family that runs an oyster company in Louisiana, in a fictional town called Golden Vale in Lafourche Parish. And this family has been in business for over 90 years, but like a lot of family businesses and a lot of families in general, they're dysfunctional. And so it follows this family as they sort of weather the BP oil spill in 2010 and traces sort of the impact on their relationships, their community, the oyster industry. And I came to the subject because I also lived in New Orleans at the time of the spill. I'd moved here after college and was waiting tables and had some aspirations to be a writer, though I didn't write very much back then. And, I was gobsmacked by the enormity of the disaster. And like a lot of people were asking, how can this happen? How did this happen, this environmental disaster? And what are going to be the long-term effects of that? And I read an interview at that time with an oyster farmer, and I didn't know anything about the oyster farming industry prior to reading that interview. I didn't know about its sort of multi-generational, family structure, and I didn't know about the state of Louisiana's leasing system. I was just fascinated, and it was kind of a little obsession of mine over the years. So years later, I decided that I would try and write a novel about it, which meant that I had a lot of research to do.
And did you meet? I assume you spoke with a lot of families, and I wondered how you went about doing the research, because it's a deeply intimate story that feels very authentic to the experiences of the characters that you're describing. And I wondered how did you go about that? I mean, something somewhat intimidating, I would imagine.
Terribly intimidated. I applied for a grant to record the oral histories of oyster farmers across Louisiana, in 3 parishes of Louisiana. And so I spent a summer just interviewing oyster farmers and also just people who are industry adjacent. I interviewed an oyster biologist. I interviewed a chemist who specialized in toxic exposure in frontline communities. And I didn't know then, because I was in graduate school, and you just don't know if you're capable of finishing a book, let alone publishing it. But I knew that those stories should be preserved and collected. So that's why I wanted to embark on the oral history project. So they're all sort of part of the public record.
Where are those interviews now?
They're all online in Baylor University's Institute of Oral History.
And Madeleine Watts, who's in the middle of a truly bonkers tour, you just came from the UK to New Orleans, and then you're about to go to Australia.
Yep.
Yeah.
Completely normal trip.
So we're very, very honored that you would make this little detour between. So Elegy Southwest is her new novel, just published here, and a really exquisite novel about two characters, a husband and wife on a road trip of sorts in the American Southwest, that plays out against a kind of environmental sort of an apocalyptic environmental dissolution of, as well, that is in step with the kind of dissolution of this relationship. But you're saying this is the first day you've been to the South, not the Southwest. Mm-hmm. But I wondered, it's one thing that this book, and I think is true of all three of these books, that is really, I find really refreshing, is that instead of, I feel like the dominant mode of environmental writing, narrative writing especially, tends to be a kind of, it's often informed by a kind of activist impulse of saying, well, if we don't change our ways, this sort of apocalypse is upon us. And all of these three books feel to me like they're a kind of, and maybe it's a generational thing, but they're a bit further down the timeline where it's, there's no question of whether things are changing, that there's this transformation underway, that even in the best case scenarios will rearrange our lives in all kinds of horrible ways. And there's something about this novel, I feel like, that really brings that forward, even if it's not the explicit focus. And I wondered if you could talk about how you originally conceived of the novel, and to what extent these sort of environmental themes were central to your composition of it.
Yeah, so the novel is a road trip set kind of along the course of the Colorado River. And the Colorado River is what at least 7 states rely on to exist, and it's running out of water. And it's been running out of water for a long time. And I first, you can probably tell I'm not from America. So when I first went to California in 2015, I'd always lived in New York. I don't know, it was New York, you've seen it in the films. But when I went to the Southwest for the first time, a lot of the plants and things, they smelt like home. They looked like home. A lot of the same things grow in the same places. So I felt this incredible sense of this uncanny feeling of home. And because I had grown up in Australia in this period in the 2000s where there was the longest drought on record, I was very aware that there was a similar drought happening in the Southwest. And in Australia, when I was growing up, like, people would get into fist fights if you had broken the water restriction laws, if you were hosing down cement. And I could see people happily hosing down cement in Phoenix, and it was fine. And that original feeling made me incredibly sad. And it sort of stoked this obsession with this particular place. And I was very aware when I was writing it that, when I was becoming aware of being interested in it, I didn't know necessarily what I was going to do with this interest. But when I eventually sat down to write what was sort of an accumulation of a lot of different trips I'd made to the Southwest and a lot of notes that I'd taken, by that point it was historical. The trip is happening in November 2018, and part of the reason I said it then, the trip is sort of a conglomerate. It's an accumulation of 2 or 3 different trips that I did. But I picked November 2018 because when I was looking at the notes, there were the fires in California that were drifting. They drifted all the way over to the East Coast, and when I was rereading my notes, I realized how eerie that was, and also the way in which I had existed during that fortnight driving around in November 2018. And you're going to a bar, you're having a drink, I was calling my dad, you're doing normal stuff, but then also noting hey, look, the fires, the sunset looks crazy, I'm having trouble breathing. And I think that is so common to most of our experience of climate change. Climate change it's global, and it doesn't happen to it doesn't really happen to us in a way that war happens to us or these other sort of big life-changing events. And I think that that's like an interesting problem for literature and for all art to confront. So when I sat down to write this, I wanted the sort of apocalyptic element, as it were, to exist side by side with like the everyday normality of life as it's lived, because I think that's how we do live right now. And I'm interested in reading stories and writing stories about what it's like to be alive right now.
Yeah, and I should say, in case it wasn't clear, that all three of these books, well, the essays and the novels, are set in a very realistic landscape. They're not, these aren't dystopias. These aren't, well, if they're dystopias, they're at least accurate dystopias. We're not in a kind of post-apocalyptic environment. We're not in the future. We're in the present or the recent past. Which is part of what makes it, I think, it's so striking about it, is that you still have these sort of elements that are terrifying, and yet they're sort of suppressed often. I think this is true of all of your work. It's sort of suppressed in the kind of mundanity of like the everyday existence. And Madeleine, I wonder if you could read. There's a passage that I think sort of handles this exquisitely. I mean, something that happens throughout the book is this sort of movement between personal crisis and this public crisis in a very subtle way. And I wonder if you could read that one passage.
I think the only information you need to know before I read this is that the main character, Eloise, is remembering her husband's mother who has recently died. In the months after she died, when you were weeping and I was holding you and rubbing your back, I would be soothed by remembering, for instance, Roland Barthes recounting how a woman from whom he was purchasing a tea cake had said, "Voilà," just as his mother had always said, "Voilà." And in that moment, he experienced his mother's death again, as if the wound reopened afresh. From just that single moment of recognition, he began to cry in the boulangerie, and then allowed himself to sob with abandon once he got home. Like you, he seemed to suffer well, calmly, around other people. It was only when he was behind closed doors that the collapse occurred. I slowed as I reached a footbridge spanning a canal, a trickle of water running through it, and made a note to myself on my phone. I had no idea where that trickle of water was going. I stopped on the footbridge, looked towards the mountains, and took a photograph on my phone, poorly lit, as though it would help me remember and understand something important when I returned to it after the trip. The heat felt atrocious, although according to the weather on my phone, it wasn't any warmer than 24 degrees. I was nevertheless dripping sweat. As I slowed to a walk by the rental car parked outside our Airbnb, I noticed that across the street a set of automatic sprinklers were watering a luridly green lawn. In the middle of the day? And with what water? How long would that lawn stay green when the level of the river fell below the intakes, when the water simply dried up?
Yeah, and there's something really beautiful about the sort of moving from the tears of Roland Barthes, I guess, and then the tears of the character mourning his mother, and then we go into a kind of the trickle of the stream, and what's sort of most remarkable about it, I think, is that there's not explicit commentary about it, but it's just sort of all part of this kind of, there's a patch, it all fits together in a way, but you don't feel the need to kind of make a big deal out of it, I don't know, or to point it out, to drag the reader through it in any more direct way.
Yeah, I was really trying to avoid that feeling that I sometimes had, because, like, you know, we're taught to write a certain way, that there would need to be paragraph breaks between these things.
Right, that whole passage is one paragraph.
That whole passage is one paragraph. And so, particularly when I was writing the book at the beginning, and I knew that I wanted these things to sit side by side and to be, like, equal, like the story about the Colorado River and the story about this marriage, which, like, one of them is, like, more globally important and one is more, like, intensely felt. And I wanted them to sit side by side and not be, they don't have a cause and effect relationship. They're intertwined. But there's no, like, you know, I didn't want to have a character in there who, like, somebody's grandfather was the evil dam builder or
Right.
anything like that.
Yeah.
Partly because, again, like, that's just not how most of us experience these things.
Right.
And so, yeah, I was really trying to do things, sometimes even in the way that the pages looked, where these things were in almost like, because the paragraph is singular, the book itself is insisting that these things are singular, because, yeah, like the refusal of paragraph breaks is a gesture towards saying, like, these are part of the same thought. That's how I understand paragraph breaks to work.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a sort of mesmerizing effect. And Joselyn, in your novel, I'm reminded of the fact that there's these. There are sort of younger activist types. There's the people, the oyster farmers, who have a very sort of another set of kind of beliefs and cultural standards. And I wondered how you navigated that sort of morass of, you're telling a story, you're not writing a polemic, and yet you wanted to represent, it seems, like the reality of the situation, where people feel very strongly about these, environmental concerns, about the oil spill, about the death of the oyster business. And I wondered whether that was a challenge to you as you move back between these characters to avoid feeling like you're in some kind of polemical world.
Absolutely. So in my novel, there are two brothers. One who's the sort of responsible older brother who runs the family oyster business, and then there's the grifter, sort of younger brother who lives in New Orleans and is bohemian and a musician, and gets sort of a share of the business profits. And this younger brother's sort of involved in an activist community in New Orleans that, at the time of the spill, organizes this protest against BP's use of chemical dispersant. And that sort of aspect is just the activist community, the protest. That was just taken from my own experience of living in New Orleans at the time. I was part of a group that organized a protest, although we were even less successful than the characters in this novel. And having sort of two brothers who are kind of on different ends of the political spectrum made sense to me, because I come from a family like that. And I think that we often sort of live in families where we exist on different sides of the political spectrum, even though we agree about certain things, like that we, in the case of this family, that the ecosystem should be protected to the extent that oyster farming is possible. And oyster farms are particularly vulnerable to environmental disasters like oil spills, because oysters are filter feeders and stuck in the ground. So it was a way of having a conversation with myself, to have two characters who represent these different perspectives, and I had fun sort of writing their arguments as much as it felt like a natural way to include part of my own experience of having lived here.
And was it important dramatically that no one particularly wins the argument? I mean, was that how, because I think in one's own life, perhaps, like, one might have very strong views about some of these questions, but it also seems like dramatically in a novel that wouldn't fly.
Right. I wanted all of the characters to be complicated and problematic in their own ways, and thus more true to life. It was the hope. And I think I didn't want to sort of create this activist character who had all of the right opinions and knew much better than his oyster farmer brother. I felt like that would be unreal and and also just sort of not true to my own experience. I learned so much from the oyster farmers that I interviewed, and had some great conversations with them about environmentalism and how that sort of interacts with their own politics in ways that are contradictions. You know, we're all a mass of contradictions, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a good lead into, Martha, this wonderful piece you wrote about, in part about your father and about sort of Book of Revelation, and perhaps you could read from that section. There's this interest in your work, I mean, not just in this essay, but there's this sort of meeting between the evangelicals and environmentalists in ways that I think might be surprising to some people who are encountering it for the first time. But this passage, I think, is a nice braiding of the two.
Sure. When I was 5 or 6 years old, my father announced from the pulpit that he would be preaching from the Book of Revelation. He asked all the children to leave, to follow our Sunday school teacher down the hall. He was worried we'd be scared by the apocalyptic language of the Bible's last book. All that fire, all those beasts. I filed out with the other kids, feeling suddenly anonymous and abandoned, like my father was keeping a secret from me. We spent that Sunday making cards for all the homebound old ladies we'd never see, though we wrote their names hundreds of times on hundreds of pieces of folded cardstock. I don't always know how to distinguish between my dad's individual beliefs and the theology of his denomination. Growing up, Methodist values like reason, discernment, and grace hovered far above other Christian concepts like salvation, redemption, and sin that I didn't hear about so much. Whether it was Methodism as a whole or my father in particular, Dad never preached much about any life other than this one, or any world other than this one. But the apocalypse is still a defining feature of evangelical theologies like the one my husband grew up with. While a 2010 Pew Research Center poll showed that just over 40% of Americans believe that Jesus will return to earth by 2050, this belief is not spread evenly across all denominations. Compared to less than a third of white mainline Protestants in churches like my father's, a majority of white evangelical Christians, over 58%, believe Christ will return to earth within the next 40 years. My father, like many contemporary mainline Protestant scholars, sees the Bible as a collection of texts written and deeply revised by people whose worldviews were necessarily constrained and influenced by their own cultural context. He reads the Bible's last book not as a prediction of the world's end, but as a coded depiction of oppression under an authoritarian empire. In this way, he argues the Bible's final book has even more relevance for our contemporary lives than if it were predicting the future. For my father, the Book of Revelation, as with all the books of the Bible, describes their then, as theologian Marcus Borg phrases it, not our now. But lately I found the language of apocalypse creeping up in my own life for the first time and with increasing frequency. When my husband and I move into our new house, a small bungalow next door to my parents and one house over from my sister and her husband, my brother-in-law begins calling our combined properties the compound. Gesturing to our 3 houses with their conjoined backyards, he jokes that Colin and I will be the ones protecting the northwest side when the world ends. We've got the eastern flank covered, he says, and your parents have got the south side. This kind of language doesn't surprise me. I don't even think to ask what danger exactly he's anticipating coming our way. It seems we all, secular or religious, conservative or liberal, sense some tension that has to give, some ending on the horizon. When my friends and I commiserate about our low-paying jobs and skyrocketing debt, we joke about the absurdity of planning for the future. My retirement plans, I say, consist entirely of assuming the world will no longer be habitable by the time I'm 65.
I mean, it's funny. It's like almost a laugh line there, but it's not really that funny. Maybe it depends on the generation that's listening to it. But I mean, it does. Reading you, like I start to see these parallels between the sort of end times language and language of climate change, and on the one hand, it's like to a certain reader or ear, when you hear talk about everyone being spirited away and into the sky, that seems far-fetched. On the other hand, it does make you wonder, well, is it far-fetched to talk with similar language about climate change? And I wonder if one thing that's really nice about your work is that you're not, again, declarative in that way, but you're examining these connections. But I wondered if you, through your writing, have reached any kind of conclusions about this.
Yeah, I think I came to the idea of apocalypse as kind of an outsider because I wasn't raised in a tradition that emphasized that. And so I've had to come at it and figure out all the different things people mean when they talk about apocalypse. And I never grew up ever reading the book of Revelation or really talking about it at all. So I'm kind of a stranger to all of this. And I think what I've found meaningful is thinking about the book of Revelation describing in poetic language the end of an empire that needed to end. And when scholars talk about apocalyptic imagination, it's this idea of seeing when a world we've created has to end or is going to end by virtue of the fact that it's unsustainable. And so that's, I think, a way of reading Revelation or apocalypse as not God coming to end the world, but that the worlds we are creating are going to end themselves because they can't be sustained. And I think that has a lot of relevance in climate change, like extractive industry, exploitation, all those kinds of systems we're creating that we sense aren't going to be able to sustain themselves. And I think it's taken me a while to kind of wrap my head around what apocalypse means to me. But if I've landed anywhere, it's being able to find a place of thinking about apocalypse that feels generative and forward-looking, not in a predicting the future, but so what world are we going to create to come after that? And that kind of imagination.
Right, because you have an interesting point about the Book of Revelation, that it's not for all of the end time aspect of it. It's actually more of a transition to another realm than just drawing the curtain over this one.
Yeah, it turns out, because I read when I was 30, I decided I should read it, and it's at the end of Revelation, there's all this description of these fires and this destructive language, and then there's this whole nother city that comes, and it has beautiful streams, and it's green and lovely, and people are there, and it's the world doesn't end at the end of the Bible. It just keeps going in a different and renewed form on the same world. And I think that really speaks to a lot of people who dearly love this world and want to see another world come through that world, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Because I think one of the dangers, sort of one of the great cliches of climate writing is that we're facing a kind of binary outcome, that it's either, an end of the world or salvation. And of course, not only is there a wide range of outcomes in between, but that we're increasingly in a kind of weird interregnum. And the question is, how do you navigate that? One thing that I find really beautiful about all of your work, but I'll go to Madeleine next, is that even in sort of the most apocalyptic scenarios and the most sort of despairing landscapes in Elegy Southwest, but I think also in some of your essays. I'm thinking about the essay you wrote about Greenpoint and the Superfund Creek, Newton Creek. But the ability to find beauty even in a completely broken, fallen landscape. And I'm reminded of a scene in this novel where the husband, they go back to Phoenix, where he's from, and he says the things that he identifies with, or the things that feel like home for him, are the artificial aspects of the place, not the mountains and the desert, but the sort of tchotchkes and all the crap, whatever. And so I wonder if you could sort of expand on that, why is it important to give license to that kind of interpretation, that even amidst the kind of bleakness, that there still might be beauty, even if it's a sort of perverse in some way?
Yeah, I think that somebody asked me a question recently about ruin lust, I feel like this was a big thing that people were talking about, particularly like 10, 15 years ago, specifically around like people photographing Detroit.
Yeah, that's what was in my head. Was Detroit.
Yeah. And like I looked at those pictures when I was like deciding where to move to in the US. I didn't know where I was going to move to, and I thought about Detroit because I had seen all these pictures, and I was like, it looks beautiful. Of course, like what I was looking at was ruins, but like, you know, if you're of a particular kind of like mindset and attitude, then, you know, a ruin, like a Gothic ruin, looks gorgeous. And I think that there's truth to that. I think that one of the things that can be really scary is, I tried to put in quite a lot of moments like that in the book, where the narrator is sort of like at some points looking at fire, like looking at a fire that's potentially dangerous, and seeing the beauty in it. And there's, I do think that there's like a link. You can make links to like the Romantic movement. That this is a kind of like neo-romanticism. But I think it's true. I think that there's one of the real difficulties of writing about climate change and writing about this kind of thing is that people often ask you questions like, "Do you have hope?" And it's really hard to answer those questions because, like, I'm not a scientist. I'm just a lady who writes books. So I can kind of I can talk to an emotional register, but you know, I don't think I wouldn't be getting asked those questions if I had written a book about difficult female friendship. But I think that one of the things that that I find hopeful is this sort of attitude that's often talked about from people like Anna Singh, which is like this paying attention and being aware of what's around you. And I think that often when you pay attention, like, yes, sometimes it's scary and sometimes it's hopeful, and sometimes what you see is beautiful. And that's the thing that I find most hopeful, and that was sort of what I wanted to put in the book, that sometimes that attitude of attention and that you know, an active practice of noticing, what it yields is sometimes frightening, but what it yields sometimes is the thing that does feel closest to hope, because if there's beauty, then there's still, you know, there's something like good about being alive.
That's well put. Yeah, I mean, it's
a big statement.
No, I love it. That's beautiful. But yes, the hope despair binary just feels ultimately, I don't know. It starts to feel so impoverished compared to with all of these other opportunities available to literature. And Joselyn, I think this is. I mean, I think of in your novel. I mean, just even the symbol of the oyster is kind of a great centralizing kind of idea, where it's, as you said, it's sort of a filtration device, and it's kind of gross, and yet there's something beautiful about it. And you're writing about a situation where there's not much, on one level, there's not much hope. I mean, there's already been this massive chemical, environmental pollution. And yet, there's something human about the characters, and fundamentally human about the characters' desire to find not just kind of salvation or something, but beauty in their lives, even in this fallen environment. And so I wonder, do you get annoyed by this sort of hope question that writers seem to get all the time in this subject?
You know, people don't ask me that, and I wonder now why. I think that this moment in particular, if you care about the planet, if you call yourself an environmentalist, it's a scary moment, and I have to tell myself that despair is paralysis, and that it won't help us sort of make progress, and I sort of struggle with that personally at like tough political moments like the ones that we're living through. But I'm just trying to take this back to my novel. The characters have to start over in and they have to find new ways to imagine their lives. And we all have to do that all the time.
We're running out of time, and we're told we can't take any questions because of protests last year. So, but I think you can probably come up afterwards and talk to people.
Maybe.
Maybe. But I thought one place to end might be, Martha, you have this great essay about green burials. Mm-hmm. And I wondered if you could just explain what that means, but then also, where do you end up on that? And I wonder if that's some kind of, maybe it's a bit sort of dark, but like if that brings us to some kind of apotheosis of this whole conversation.
Yeah, I wrote an essay about conservation cemeteries across the South and traveled around to a few different ones. And the first one in the whole country is called Ramsey Creek in South Carolina, and the people who founded it was just dedicated to like environmentalism. And then I went to a conservation cemetery owned by an evangelical church in South Carolina, and for them it was this really interesting mix of like, we are not doing environmentalism because that's not Christian. But, this seems to be a better way of burying people for all these reasons. And one of the things that was really interesting was that they said, we don't believe you should preserve dead bodies because that's like mitigating your hope in Jesus to resurrect you. Like you should have more hope than to be embalmed. And so you should be able to trust that God's going to figure this out. And then I went to a couple others in East Tennessee and Middle Tennessee. And I think what was really interesting to me was to ask kind of theological questions in this space where, like, when you're putting a beloved person into the earth forever, there's going to be this mixture of really spiritual and really, like, grounded earth-based questions that come into play there in people's decisions about death care. And it was really beautiful to talk to people who are kind of doing, like the evangelical church in South Carolina. They're doing this environmental work out of a totally different set of beliefs. And I think I'm really curious about like how much space can we make in environmental action and in conservation for people who are coming to it for different reasons and out of different beliefs. And as for how I feel about like natural burial, I mean, I wish I could have like signed up on the spot. It seems really cool. But I think like learning about conservation cemeteries in general was just very inspirational to me.
But it also seems like there's a kind of a fascinating nexus of this sort of religious belief and this kind of extreme environmental, almost radical environmentalism that animates a lot of your work, but it feels like they kind of meet together in this one intervention.
Yeah, and it's like even the places that said they were strictly environmental, would talk to me about how the majority of their clientele were religious people from around the South who would say, the church is an edifice to worship God, but the earth is God, and it was really surprising how they intersected with each other. There was one place, and that cemetery, they said they came into it for environmental purposes, but that the feeling of the place changed after they buried the first body, which was the body of a stillborn baby of a friend of theirs. And it was really interesting to see the way I think spirituality kind of intersects and just informs the way people live in the world. And the way people kind of ended up in this, like, they kind of ended up in a kind of paradoxically like shared place, even though they came from all different kind of sometimes cross purposes with each other, which is a cool place to be.
The grave, literally.
Yeah.
Shared place. Well, thank you all for coming out, and please join me in thanking these wonderful writers.